Good morning, everyone in Washington, and greetings to everyone joining us remotely. My name is Tafaza Pasmanasvan. I'm a partner here at Foley Hoag in the International Litigation Arbitration Department. And we are really delighted to be hosting this event. It's an important discussion that has been organized by Geneva Call, American Society of International Law, and the AU College of Law. We're very fortunate to be joined by three experts in this field. First of all, Christy Edwards, who is head of policy programs and legal of Geneva Call. Prior to joining Geneva Call, Christy led the Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. She has also served as the Director of International Humanitarian Law at the American Red Cross for many years, among other leadership roles with NGOs and international organizations. And ASIL, I know, is very proud that she's a member of the Executive Council and has also founded the Women's Mentoring Program within ASIL that has mentored 700 and counting people. So it's wonderful to have you, Christy, and grateful to you for organizing this event. We're also joined by Tasha Gill. Thank you for joining, Tasha. She It'd be great if people could mute who are joining remotely so we can all hear each other. Thank you. Tasha.
We no longer hear you.
You're muted.
Thank you, Kevin. So we have Tasha Gill, who is the Senior Advisor for Child Protection and Emergencies at UNICEF. Prior to joining UNICEF, she was the humanitarian advisor of the US mission to the United Nations, where she focused on humanitarian crises in Africa. And she's also served as the country director of the IRC in Mali and as a child protection specialist for UNICEF in various country offices, including Uganda, Nepal, Madagascar, and the DRC. And our third expert is Leisha Beardmore. Leisha is Senior Advisor on Gender-Based Violence and Prevention and Response with Save the Children US. She's joining from New York. She previously worked with Amnesty International in a number of roles, including as the lead on children in armed conflict. Prior to joining Amnesty International, she oversaw child protection and women's protection and empowerment for IRC in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, among various other roles with NGOs and multilateral institutions. Thank you for joining us. It was incredible to realize the nature of this problem in just the description that 1 in 6 children are within 30 miles of an active combat zone, and some of them have endured incredible horrors in being such close proximity. And the goal today is to focus in particular on the role that armed groups and de facto authorities, AGDAs, can do to make the situation better, because we have this comprehensive international legal framework, but some people are harder to reach than others, and it will be great to hear what your various institutions are doing to engage them. And we want this conversation to be as interactive as possible. So please don't hesitate to raise your hand, virtual hand, your in-person hand, and with any questions you have. And we'll also have a chance to engage once we hear a bit more from our speakers. So perhaps we can start with you, Tasha, and you could just provide us an overview of this international legal framework that currently exists for child protection in armed conflict.
Sure, thank you so much. And thanks very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to join you for this discussion and all of the panelists. Taffy, I don't see you anymore, but I hear you loud and clear, and that's the most important thing right now. So thank you for the questions. And I'm happy to speak briefly to the legal framework on the issue of children in armed conflict and the protection of children in armed conflict situations, and then get more into a deep dive of different pieces of that work as we continue the conversation. So to start us off, clearly we're going to look at IHL, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. And in international humanitarian law, it sets out that children must be given special protection. And this obviously is critical. It's the foundation for everything we do in armed conflict situations to prevent and respond to the violations that they experience. It's critical to note that in the 77, there you are, great to see you again. In the 77 Geneva Protocols, this is where we set out the specific protections and safety for children, and that parties to conflict are responsible for providing protection to children. I'm just going to highlight a couple of pieces that I think are especially important for today's conversation, but obviously the entire body is critical for the work that we do. First of all, to highlight that in an armed conflict situation, children should only be moved from their areas of origin where they're living in their besieged areas and evacuated when it's for their safety or health only. And linked to this, I want to highlight the importance of family unity and preventing family separation during armed conflict and displacement. This is a critical piece that's already highlighted then and continues to be of utmost importance in the work that we do. Of course, this also sets out, the IHL also sets out the prohibition of the use of children in armed conflict by all parties to conflict. And as we know, there is a prohibition against children under 15, the issue of 15 to 18, priority should be given to those who are oldest. But the other thing that I really wanted to highlight that I think is critical for the work that we all do, provide protection for children, is that when children do participate in armed conflict, they must be given special treatment as children. And we'll talk more about this and how they should be viewed as victims, because first and foremost, their rights have been violated by being used in an armed conflict. So with that, let me turn now to human rights law. And especially as UNICEF, always very happy to talk about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, 1989, as you know, and highlight perhaps a few of the important aspects for today's conversation, while of course underlining that the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, covers all aspects: civil, economic, social, cultural, and economic rights. But in terms of our conversation, there are special protections there for refugee children, the prohibition of torture of children, protection from hazardous work, which we know the worst form of child labor is use by parties to conflict in armed conflict. But also there's a specific protection of children in armed conflict situations. And specifically, it says that state parties shall take all feasible measures to ensure protection. And this is very important in terms of the engagement work that we do with parties. The other thing that I would like to highlight here is that two things. One is rehabilitation after conflict is also in the CRC, as well as juvenile justice, both of which are absolutely critical to all of the work that we do in supporting children during and after an armed conflict situation. More generally, the CRC is useful in framing and guiding the work that we do, even in armed conflict situations, with a focus on their human dignity. Again, the importance of the role of family in a child's life. We know that a child has the best chances to survive and thrive in a family setting. And also non-discrimination, a critical principle of the CRC and absolutely vital in many of the armed conflict situations where we are working, both to ensure that discrimination does not take place during or after a conflict. The CRC sets out clear obligations, and states have an obligation then, when after ratifying, to bring these standards into their own legislation. It's no longer nice to have, it's a must have. And this is very important as a basis for our engagement with governments and the international community to protect children in armed conflict situations. So with those two major bodies, let me just touch very quickly. There's also on a couple of other items, there's the optional protocol, of course, which is critical in terms of bringing the prohibition of recruitment to 18. This is very important for our engagement work and advocacy work. There's also, the Convention on the Elimination of the Worst Forms of Child Labor, as I mentioned earlier. This covers the use of children, child soldiers, as is often said. But there are also other important bodies that are helpful to us. For example, the international criminal law. And as we know, this then, I'm sure Leisha will also speak to this, gets into the issue of recognizing rape and sexual slavery and other forms of sexual violence as a war crime and a crime against humanity. So all of these come together in order to provide a legal framework that's the basis for our engagement, the basis for our advocacy for the rights of children in conflict situations, and also the basis for the Security Council resolutions. And we can come back to that later, in UNICEF's role in implementing those resolutions that monitor and report on the 6 grave violations against children in armed conflict situations, and what we do with parties to conflict in order to prevent and end them. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Tasha. That's really helpful to have this broad overview. And with all the areas that you've discussed, what are UNICEF's priorities currently?
Thank you. Perhaps I could speak to 2 different types of priorities at this time. One of them is about where these armed conflicts are taking place, and the other is about the thematic issues that are keeping us all up at night, whether we are working in these country situations or at the global level. So first of all, just to say that, as I mentioned, the Security Council resolutions, there are many of them that touch on the issue of children in armed conflict, especially 1612, that gives this mandate for monitoring and reporting. Since the Secretary General started listing the situations of armed conflict that require us then to engage in order to put in place measures to prevent and end the use of children in all 6 grave violations, I would say that there are 10 situations that have been there since 2005. It's unacceptable. This has been going on for a long time. Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Colombia, DRC, Iraq, Myanmar, Israel, the state of Palestine, Somalia, Sudan, Philippines. I'm going through them quickly because there's 10 of them, but they have been on this annual report since 2005. So we really would like to see how we can work together, the international community, national communities, civil society organizations, line ministries, all coming together in order to address these protracted conflict situations and the ongoing impact for now generations of children. A second point is about the Sahel region. And as we know that there's a support plan for the Sahel that focuses on 10 countries in the Sahel, very concerned about how the conflict situation there is expanding in that region and affecting children, preventing them from going to school, displacing them, separating them from families, and making them more and more at risk of the grave violations against children in conflict. Some of these are escalating significantly over the past 3 years, and we now have new situations added to this SG's report that we need to implement a monitoring and reporting mechanism for. These are Burkina, Cameroon, Chad, and Niger. This is the opposite trend of where we want to be going, and very disturbing. Linked to this, obviously, is cross-border impacts. In terms of the thematic issues of concern and where we are increasingly focusing our attention and engagement, while of course upholding all of the standards and monitoring reporting on all 6 grave violations, one thing of top concern for me is the increasing detention of children in situations of armed conflict. And we do have some good news. Recently, handover protocols were signed in both Nigeria and Burkina Faso. This is huge. It took 3 years of engagement to get there. This means that when children are encountered in a field of operation during military operations, they should be handed over promptly to civilian authorities, to competent child protection services in order to address their case, rather than held by military because they're children, because of these special protections for children that we talked about. So the work that it takes to get these handover protocols in place is significant and challenging, a far cry from what it was 20 years ago or 25 years ago when I started out. And I think part of this is due to the increasing securitization of engagement. And this is linked undoubtedly to growing counterterrorism frameworks, legal and policy frameworks in many of the armed conflict situations where we're operating. It makes it more challenging for us to ensure that children are promptly handed over to competent civilian authorities for their reunification and reintegration into their families and communities. The issue of girls has been and continues to be a top priority in armed conflict situations. While they are perhaps more visible than they were 20 years ago, they are still largely invisible, and their specific needs require our consolidated collective attention to make sure that they're not stigmatized and that they have access to the services and support that they specifically need following the many different types of violations that they generally experience in armed conflict situations. And then, as I've mentioned several times, you've probably noticed a common thread throughout what I'm highlighting in terms of the legal framework and the work that we do, and that is the issue of family separation during armed conflict and the importance of legal identity and family unity in order to prevent family separation, because we know children are generally safer, better protected, and better able to thrive when they're with their families rather than separated on their own or in institutional care, which is not the best place for them, whether it's during a conflict or outside of conflict situations. This is relevant across many of the different armed conflicts where we're currently operating, and I'd be happy to do a deep dive on any one of these thematic issues that we are pushing forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and they're all fascinating, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk more about those. Just on securitization, do you mind explaining a bit more how that's come about and how it's evolving and the challenges that you're facing as a result in protection of children in armed conflict as a result of this securitization?
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, from my perspective, having done this work for a very long time, the experience of children in these armed conflicts remains terribly consistent. They experience these violations of killing and maiming, sexual violence, abduction, recruitment, use, forced to witness and to conduct horrific things against one another, their families, their communities, other human beings. And yet, as we look around the world at how the international community and nations are addressing the changing nature of armed conflict and increasingly the designation of armed groups as terrorist groups, the frameworks that are put in place in order to address this evolution affects children as well, whether they are allegedly associated with such armed groups or living under the control of such armed groups. And this applies to Iraq, to Syria, but also to many other situations where we're working, whether it's Nigeria and the Sahel, Somalia. In all of these situations, armed groups have been designated as terrorist armed groups, and therefore some of the frameworks that are put in place to address this particular type of armed conflict have knock-on effects for children, whether it's watch lists or whether it's detention on security grounds. These are all things that we are actively engaging in those policy fora to highlight the rights of the children on the same legal basis that I laid out in the very beginning. Those rights do not go away, and they apply in all contexts, including in situations where armed groups have been designated as terrorist groups.
Thank you so much. Picking up on the humanitarian issues, Leisha, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the humanitarian approach that you've taken to child protection and the work you've done that Save the Children is focusing on.
Sure. Thank you so much both for having me, and also Tasha. It was really interesting hearing everything you shared. Just as a flag, there is a question in the chat. Do you want to wait on that, or do you want me to jump in?
Maybe we can hear from you and then
Sure.
address those questions just after we hear from each of you. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really wonderful to be here with everyone. I'm excited to hear from all of the community that we have here and to hear your questions and things as well. So as for the introduction, my name is Leisha, and I'm currently working with Save the Children US as the Senior Advisor on Gender-Based Violence Prevention and Response. I'm quite new in the role, so this is going to be kind of the introduction, and then given my role as well, I'll talk a bit more about the gender piece. So I think it's really important when we're talking about children in armed conflict, when we're thinking about the accountability piece, also thinking about the humanitarian services that are needed by different children, and making sure we're thinking about the unique needs of boys and girls, and really all children of different ages in different contexts, and working and learning from those children and from communities about what works, what supports them, what is really meeting the specific needs across the issues that are faced within children on conflict and crisis. Like, for example, that might be support, having parenting support with case management, child protection case management, really thinking through the links between child protection and cash and voucher assistance, mental health and psychosocial supports, livelihoods for families and adolescents, thinking through how we're doing monitoring reporting, but how that isn't tied into the provision of services. So we're making sure that humanitarian services are a right for the child in that situation and not contingent on them reporting. Thinking about social cohesion and peace building, tying that in with social behavior change, and really then engaging with community and religious leaders and education. And this, all of this really ties into the fact that we need to be thinking about humanitarian services in relation to CAC from a multi-sectoral approach. Now, I think when we talk about humanitarian services in relation to CAC, it's quite understandable for us to think about case management, but this is very specialized and requires quite a lot of training and support. And it's not the only way that we can be engaging. But to have this multi-sectoral, child-centered approach requires sustainable, consistent funding that is based off the actual and real needs of children in crisis. So when we're thinking about humanitarian services, it's how are we listening to the communities that we're supporting, and how are we learning with them and understanding needs and change over time. That really does then mean youth-led participation, making sure we're thinking about this also in terms of access and safety, but also from that child rights lens. Now, when it comes back to gender, which I'm obviously going to be bringing up given the work that I've been doing, we also then have to think that not all children's needs are the same. And even when we're thinking about the grave violations more broadly, all of those different violations are going to be gendered in some way. And this is where I kind of really want to advocate for the importance of having gender analysis, not just in relation to sexual violence, but across all of the grave violations, because it's easier for us to think about the impact of sexual violence on girls. But sexual violence doesn't only happen to girls, and across all of these grave violations, there are going to be gendered components. And when we think about, for example, recruitment and use and how that is gendered and what we understand as recruitment and use, we really do benefit from having that gender lens as well as a child rights lens. So then kind of digging in a little bit, I won't go in to start off with the SAVE specific programming, but if you poke me in that direction, I will go there. When we're thinking about this in terms of humanitarian services and gender, just to kind of move on to this point slightly, as Tasha mentioned, in relation to sexual violence especially, there is a limited mandate. And so within the MRM, when we're thinking about the documentation of sexual violence, it is incredibly difficult to document. This is because of stigma, this is because of shame, because of patriarchal norms that form barriers for children to disclose. It's already incredibly difficult for disclosure of sexual violence in locations that have systems that are survivor-centered and trauma-informed, let alone in spaces where doing so is around documentation, and the systems around documentation aren't necessarily connected to those around humanitarian service provision. So thinking about how do we work to learn from children more broadly? How do we learn from survivors and those at risk to be able to create programming and support at the community level and more broadly that enables and supports really safe reporting and safe documentation, as well as access to humanitarian services. And I do think it's really important that we both recognize the links between service provision and accountability, but also that service provision is not a route to accountability, but rather a kind of a good in itself. Thinking about that then around underreporting, it's just come up again and again. There has been improvements in the disaggregation within the annual report in terms of when experiences of grave violations are occurring against girls and boys, but really fostering that systematic approach of having data disaggregation not just by gender, but really intersectionally. We know that children in situations of armed conflict are going to be at heightened risk when they're living with a disability. So being able to understand that both supports with accountability and holds people to account, but also then enables that funding to flow back in to the people who need it most. And it does then tie back into making sure that we don't have either a child's rights lens or a gender lens, but these need to work together in order for us to have programming that meets the needs of the people we're supporting, and that we're knowing what's happening. And that only happens with data disaggregation. And it feels like we've been talking about data disaggregation for so long. It's been a conversation we've been having at this point, I think, for decades. But it's still true. Like, we're still not there. We still need to be stronger and more intentional. And that isn't just something that's going to be happening at the DC, New York, Geneva level. That also requires us to empower the staff who are doing the monitoring and verification in the context themselves, the support for the CTFMRs, the task forces for monitoring and reporting at the country levels, to be able to do that and to have the resources to do that well. Tell me if I'm talking too much, by the way. I can pause. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Because I can talk about this for hours, so I have to be careful. So when we're thinking about the invisibility of violations against girls, there's been quite a lot that's been coming up increasingly about this. It's something that is coming to our attention, and I think that awareness is powerful as long as we do something with the awareness. Like, we know now that there's, I guess a lot of people always knew, but there's an increasing awareness and discussion of the invisibility of violations against girls. So then it's a case of, okay, well, how do we adapt our systems? How do we adapt our programming so that girls are not being invisibilized? And within that we understand these different intersectional identities of girls so that their voices can be heard, and so that we can learn from them as well as us supporting them. It needs to go both ways. And similarly, we often think about boys in terms of recruitment for active combat roles, but there is issues around recruitment and abduction that also occurs against girls. I'm not even going to go into the non-binary issues and gender expansive children worldwide, because there's such little data on this and such little avenues for safe data collection. But this said, gendered roles and expectations in combination with this focus of collecting data that is accessible, it tends to mean that data is collected more in relation to boys. So that then ties us really into thinking about, well, how can we increase our investment in humanitarian services? As we said at the beginning, child protection, and as Tasha was talking about with family tracing and keeping families together, how can we learn at the community level these barriers and then overcome them in a way that is community-led, that is youth-led, that is us supporting systems at the community level to shine, rather than us saying what needs to happen. It's how do we work together with communities, and how do we advocate at the global level to support that to happen? And that really does require us to be thinking about child protection, GBV, sexual reproductive health and rights services to be considered as essential. Us thinking about staffing at the community, national levels, and understanding gender parity within that. We can talk a lot about who are we reaching within communities, but also the staffing that we employ is a key part of that. And the gaps and barriers sometimes to recruiting women as staff at the national level can be overcome by speaking with women and finding out the barriers to applying, and then adjusting our policies and systems so that we can move towards that. And it's about being intentional and us kind of humbling ourselves to learn from the people who we're working with, so that we can create things that are fairer and that we're more accountable as well to the people that we're serving. I think one other thing before I pause is just thinking again about how we are really building up systems and how that then ties into the work that's already taking place. So that might be from engaging with community leaders and building that loop between policy and advocacy and programming, but it really is connected to how are we working together, how are we coordinating? And I know that part of this discussion is also around access and across these grave violations, and it really does require us to work together, not just at the global level, but really at the local community level as well, to understand what needs to happen and to kind of walk the talk to make that possible.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating to hear all of the advances, and it's particularly heartening to hear of the efforts that are being made to listen more and understand the needs of the people the organizations are trying to assist. What are you finding out about the specific needs of girls and young girls and adolescents, and how are you using that information in the work that you're doing with Save the Children?
Yeah, I think in terms of, thank you for the question, first of all. I think in terms of the specific needs of adolescents and the things that are coming up, one of the first is that, I mean, I know I'm kind of throwing this back to what I said before, but it's going to be different needs in different spaces, and understanding, for example, when girls are being forced to leave education systems and the impact that will then have, understanding the gendered barriers to situations like that, understanding what drives family separation and then exacerbates risk factors around, for example, abduction, recruitment, or other grave violations such as sexual violence in conflict. So I definitely don't want to speak for a global needs, because I think that on a different context will have different needs for different children. One thing that is coming up quite consistently, and there's been work done on this at the global level, is us really being intentional as well around MHPSS. So thinkings around mental health and psychosocial support and how that ties in. So how are we across the work on children armed conflict thinking about mental health and psychosocial support, not just in terms of specialized systems? And, I think sometimes when we think about that at the global level, we think about psychologists and psychiatrists, but it's not just about that. It's working with communities. It's understanding how we can support at these different points when there's risk factors, when children are being reintegrated back into communities. How do we work together to create this holistic system? And one of the things that comes up specifically and has come up is not specifically targeting those children for one intervention, but working across the community to understand how we both meet basic needs and provide those life-saving services. And also beyond that, how we connect this into other services such as livelihoods, which may not get talked about as much, but is so important if we're thinking about the holistic approach to supporting communities in crisis. And that will trickle down to risk factors, both in terms of children armed conflict, but also in terms of early and forced marriage and unions for children. We see these exacerbations of risk that we can support when we have sustainable, consistent access to humanitarian funding that is based off the actual needs from the communities, that comes from gender and context analysis.
Thank you. Let me turn to Christy in the room. Please, could you tell us a bit more about what Geneva Call is doing, and specifically in relation to AGDAs?
Thanks. Well, first I want to say a huge thanks to Taffy, to you and your colleagues for hosting today's event, and as well, of course, to ASIL and to WCL for co-host or co-sponsoring today. For those of you who are not familiar with Geneva Call, we are a humanitarian organization, which is, of course, neutral, impartial, and independent, based in Geneva, Switzerland, but with field presences in many countries around the world where there are ongoing armed conflicts. And so our mission is slightly different than some of the other humanitarian organizations. And so we specifically work with armed groups and de facto authorities to improve the protection of civilians during armed conflict through humanitarian engagement, working with AGDAs around humanitarian norms and principles, and not necessarily by waltzing in with a big stack of international treaties, but having a sustained and consistent relationship over a long period of time, where we talk about humanitarian principles, but using local language, local customs, local norms, local religious practices or traditions, to have a conversation about these principles with the context that they understand and the norms and frameworks that are familiar to them. And so we work with these different armed groups around a number of thematic topics, including the protection of children and engagement around protecting education as well. And we do this through a variety of both direct and indirect engagement. And so we do quite a number of capacity building or training workshops, and to build their awareness and hopefully eventually their respect of these humanitarian norms and principles. We work through a few different modalities, the first of which, for those of you who are familiar with our work, is called a deed of commitment, which is it's a unilateral declaration, basically, by the armed group to incorporate these humanitarian principles into their own codes of conduct, into their own rules of engagement, their own internal operating systems. And that is, it's signed in the Canton of Geneva with Geneva Call as a witness and with the Canton of Geneva as the holder of the document. But it does have some implementation requirements by the group itself to start implementing these principles in their own engagement. And so one of these deeds of commitment is specifically around the protection of children and educational facilities. At the moment, we have 31 AGDAs that have signed the deed of commitment on protecting children in armed conflict. And this deed of commitment is based on many of the legal frameworks that Tasha mentioned earlier. So the Geneva Conventions, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Optional Protocol, et cetera. And it specifically talks about the prohibition of recruitment, use, or forced association of children in military or armed groups. And this is, of course, based on international humanitarian law as well as human rights frameworks. It does use the human rights framework of 18 years as the threshold of participating in armed conflict, which is actually higher than the IHL standard. So we're sort of in the unique realm where the armed groups who have signed this deed of commitment have a higher standard than even the state parties to these issues. So it is actually a really interesting way of encouraging these armed groups to be able to incorporate these humanitarian norms and to make sure that children are protected in the areas that they control. The deed of commitment also covers the release of children who have been either detained or under the control of the armed forces. Covers protection of education against hostilities. So for those of you who are familiar with the Safe Schools Declaration, which means no military use of schools and to avoid exposing schools to the effects of armed conflict. So basically no taking shelter in a school during the armed conflict or using it as a military base, for example, as well as protection of children and teachers, and also to provide children with aid and care to the extent of their ability. So as Lisa was mentioning earlier, access to education, health and food, protection from sexual violence and other forms of violence, and reunification of children with their families. I think as Tasha was saying, one of the biggest harms that we see is when children are taken away from their families who can often provide the most protection for them. And so we work directly with the armed groups around training on the principles included in the deed of commitment, but we also work quite closely with other community groups, other stakeholders, local leaders. That could be religious leaders, it could be community activists, it could be elderly individuals within a community that are well respected, those who have a voice, and that would encourage these armed groups to encourage them to protect the civilians under their control. And unlike a traditional military force, most of the members of these AGDAs are former civilians themselves. They come from these local communities. Their families still live there. They have a vested interest in protecting their families during these armed conflicts, as well as their community members. And so for many of these community groups, it's important for them to be able to have the ability to have an open dialogue with these armed groups, to be able to go and have open communication with them around the protection needs that they have, and to be able to give them a common language or dialogue around, what it is that they're asking for. So making sure that, when they're asking for protection, they're asking for it in the same way, using ideas and terminology that will be commonly understood, whether that comes from Sharia law or that comes from local custom or a national law, whatever the framework might be, just making sure that they have the ability to have that conversation together. So maybe I'll stop there. And
It's fascinating
yeah.
to hear your approach, and 31 commitment, deeds of commitment is really impressive.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about the tangible results that have come from this engagement and the commitments that have been concluded?
Sure. So I'll give a couple of examples. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 2021, following an armed group's signature of a unilateral declaration on the protection of children, some of the local leaders of an armed group ordered the group's units to verify the age of all of the military unit members, which resulted in the release of 34 children. So good that they checked. In Iraq, following the launch of a community-based project in Sinjar, the Sinjar resistance units they were alleged to have committed grave child rights violations. They agreed to train all of their fighters on child protection and humanitarian norms, and to leave school buildings that their forces had occupied. In Myanmar, also in 2021, following the adoption of the deed of commitment, the Restoration Council of the Shan States, or the RCSS, agreed to provide the children in its care living in locally run schools. They made sure that they had reestablished contact with their families, some of them for the first time in 4 years, which of course made a huge difference to those children, many of whom hadn't seen their families or their parents in many, many years, and who felt a much stronger sense of security once they were reunited. I want to leave time for questions, so maybe I'll stop there, but happy to chat more.
That's great to hear. And just before we open up to questions and participation and comments, what do you see as the main challenges? What are the main challenges and opportunities worth working with armed groups? And
yes, so there's a few. I think one of the biggest challenges that we see for Geneva Call, maybe as a broader humanitarian issue, is the bigger operational environment. And so counterterrorism laws and policies often criminalize or delegitimize humanitarian engagement with AGDAs. And this affects children associated with designated terrorist groups. And so rather than being seen as victims of a violation of IHL or human rights law, such as the prohibition of recruiting children, many of these children tend to be treated as perpetrators or violators of these legal frameworks themselves, and they're frequently detained. So that'd be the first challenge that we see. On the needs of girls or adolescent girls, I think Lisa very much covered it very thoroughly, so I won't need to go into too much difference here. But just to reiterate, the different ways of being associated with armed groups is something that really needs to be taken into consideration. There's certainly some particular issues with respect to forced marriages or early marriages when associated with armed groups. So making sure that marriages are recognized when necessary, and that especially that children born of these marriages are also recognized and cared for. A lot of times there's a lot of stigma for children born of these marriages as well. Child recruitment, of course, attacks on schools are some of the bigger challenges that we see. A lack of economic opportunity at the household or family level that can then push children to join AGDAs, such as some of the instances where we're seeing this in Syria. And it could also be for some gendered reasons. So in order to find protection from early marriage, for example, they might be they might have a more internal push to join or support armed forces. And then finally, a lack of funding for organizations that work on reintegration of children. As far as opportunities goes, access, I think, is really key. Protection of children tends to be a really good entry point when having these discussions with armed groups. Children, of course, are absolutely vital in all communities, and so being able to talk to these armed groups about how can we ensure better protection of their children is a great way to start a conversation. Integrating the gender aspects and to be able to have fairly concrete results in the short to medium term around demobilization of children who have been engaged in armed forces. And I think the overall goal, of course, is to avoid some of the long-term effects, such as having a generation of children without education or social cohesion. Another opportunity here, I would say, is the access to the broader community around that might be living under the control of an armed group or de facto authorities. We heard when Tati started, there's so many people that are living under the control of armed groups now, and so being able to talk to them about the broader humanitarian needs they might be facing. This is a really great way to engage that community and in that conversation. And then finally, on the protection of educational facilities, this is one of the most essential points in order to prevent recruitment of children into armed forces or armed groups. So that would be some of the bigger challenges and opportunities that we would flag.
Thank you so much. I'd love to hear from all of you many of you are in this field and have your own views on all of these issues that we're discussing. Anybody have a comment or question?
And the microphones are on your tables.
And as you comment or ask a question, it'd be great if you could introduce yourself. I see Marwa has a question. Please go ahead.
Yes, hi everyone. So this is Marwa from Syria. I'm a humanitarian worker in Syria, and as the Syrian crisis has been going for a decade, children continue to pay the heaviest price. So as Tasha mentioned, children moving from conflict zones to safer places, for example, camps, IDPs and refugees numbers are still increasing. So for example, now Al Hol camp has 14,300 shelters, and we're facing big humanitarian challenges. Sorry, one sec. Yes, I'm having some troubles with the connection. Okay, so it has for now 14,300 shelters, and we're facing big humanitarian challenges, especially due to lack of health facilities and access to safe water sources, which has led today to cholera outbreak in the area, and so also now in Lebanon. So what are the intervention today as humanitarian actors should focus on in Syria regarding child protection? And what is the urgent response that should be highlighted in this situation? So yeah, that's my question. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Mara. Any of you three want to take the question first?
I can jump in, or Tasha, if you want to go first.
Go ahead, Leisha, I'll come in after.
Okay, thank you so much, Marwa. I used to work in Northeast Syria for a couple of years, and I worked in Al Hol camp. So yeah, hearing you talk, I was like, wow, it's things are consistent. I think I want to make sure I've answered everything you've shared. So I'll do my best, and if anything is missing, please do let me know, because I tried to get it down, but I might miss some things. Okay, so you mentioned around the health crisis and the child protection crisis within Syria. I think that, I can only speak from my own experience, but I think that, again, Syria is this incredible and highly complex context, and depending on where we're specifically speaking about, the needs will be very different. I think that at least when I was there was a lot of really strong local organizations who were doing really incredible work in Northeast Syria. So understanding what specific support and programming would be useful. I know I keep coming back to this, but I do think it is also about speaking with those child protection, those child rights agencies that are present. I mean, in Northeast Syria, for example, there are so many great organizations and incredible staff who are working on issues around child protection and health within a humanitarian lens. I think having those conversations together, understanding what is happening, doing this needs assessment and understanding what that is first to be able to frame it is really useful. And then moving on from there, I think that there is programming that can be adapted. I'm very happy to chat to you more about this if it would be of interest. I think that specifically with what you mentioned around services in terms of child protection. Okay, cool. Yeah, that's fine. I can share my email with you. But yeah, I think specifically in terms of services around child protection, I know Tasha mentioned around before, sorry, I keep pinging back to you, Tasha, specifically around like family tracing. And I know that within Northeast Syria, particularly in terms of connecting between Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, Hasakeh, there's been a lot of movement. So centering in how we create systems for protection and also how we work with communities and with children and with community-based child protection organizations to support that while grounding it in this multi-sectoral approach so that the health needs of children and individuals across the lifespan are supported, for me is key. But of course it has been a little while since I was there, and I can definitely chat to you more. I'll put my email in the chat because I'm happy to chat. Okay, if I don't know if that answered all of your questions from that perspective. If not,
Yes,
do tell
yes.
me.
Thanks.
Okay, cool.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Leisha. Go ahead, Tasha.
Yeah, thanks. To complement what Leisha said, and to thank you, Mama, for the question, perhaps just to highlight 2 points in addition. One is that we are actively working to address all of the service needs in Al-Hol and the other camps, and the security restrictions, as you know, and the access restrictions make that incredibly challenging. In terms of the child protection in particular, our goal is to work with civil society organizations and communities for the reintegration of children and their families outside of camps where the conditions are absolutely unacceptable, to home communities where conditions should be better. But we know that that's not the case yet. So it's really a big challenge. What I want to highlight is the issue of the return and reintegration of children from other countries, including Iraq, as well as 60 additional countries who continue to be in Al-Hol, Al-Roj, and other locations, including detention facilities. And we're very concerned about children who are in prison facilities with adults who do not have access to services. So working jointly with others to identify ways in which they can repatriate and have access again to family life and to education and all of the basic services. This is a challenge that has been with us for 3.5 years, as you know, and progress is happening, but is way too slow. And we would like to see how we can make significant impact for the return and reintegration of all children who are living in camp and prison facilities in Northeast Syria, Syrian and international. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Mernouche. You can go ahead.
Yes,
and for
thank you.
people who are
Yeah.
who are not online in the room, there was a heart that Myra gave for the responses that she got from Tasha and Leisha. I just wanted to share that. Please go ahead, Manoush.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Mehnoush. I'm an Iranian lawyer from Iran. My question is about currently situation in Iran. As you know, during the last 5 weeks, many people in Iran have faced severe violence from regime forces. Many of them were teenagers and students. According to Amnesty International, on October 13, more than 23 children have been killed so far by security forces. And schools, even elementary schools, have been attacked by the forces. Students have been beaten, and many more have been killed in the streets. And now there is a question. In fact, yes, I know this situation maybe according to the international law is not considered as an armed conflict, but it's a revolution and not just as a demonstration. So there's a question: what's the role of UNICEF in this situation, in this terrible situation? And we are very delighted to know what this UNICEF can do can do. Sorry, in this situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marnoush. Tasha, it'd be great to hear what UNICEF is doing.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks, Marnoush, for putting the spotlight on this situation as well. And as you know, UNICEF does have a country office in Iran. Across the board in many, many countries, children are participating in demonstrations, in political demonstrations, and they have a right to safe participation in a way that makes their voices heard. And at all times, governments are responsible for ensuring the protection and safety of children who are participating and making their voices known. This is a challenge in many, many different countries where we work, and that includes the situation of Iran. The use of violence against children is never acceptable. And again, the issue of detention of children requires their quick release to either family or to competent authorities. All of the things that I'm saying are in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. As I mentioned earlier, all of their rights, including civil and political rights, are covered. So this is the position of UNICEF, whether it's in this country or any other country. We understand that children have, evolving capacities, and so they are able to make decisions and participate in line with their capacity as they grow. We take a life course approach. So clearly the understanding of a young child versus an adolescent is different. And we recognize that in terms of their ability to participate. UNICEF works with young people around the world to make sure that their voices are heard and that they can do that with safety and dignity. So perhaps I'll stop there in terms of your question to me, what is UNICEF's position on this? And I've highlighted how important it is that young people can speak up safely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tasha. I know there are a couple of people with comments or questions in the room. Go ahead. Anybody, just put the mic on.
Great. So I'm a first-year law student at GW, and then prior to law school, I worked in international humanitarian law research for years at Stanford Center for International Security Cooperation. I have a question for Christy about relationship development between Geneva Call and AGDAs. I imagine like such relationship development could be stigmatized by governments or other, I guess, even humanitarian groups. I'm really interested in how you develop those relationships and then balance sort of that development within the humanitarian.
Sure, thank you. It's a great question. So we have a number of field presences at the country level, and those teams are primarily based of local actors, local individuals who come from these communities themselves. And so we believe it's vitally important that they be leading these conversations and developing these relationships. It's not really seen as legitimizing the groups. It's more of a recognition, I think, within the humanitarian community, within the local community, who all see Geneva Call as a neutral, impartial, independent organization that is primarily concerned with the protection of civilians. And we could probably have a much longer conversation around views on neutrality. You know, it's a bigger issue for, I think, for the humanitarian community about what exactly that means. But I think because we are starting from the premise of how do we protect civilians, it leads to, well, it doesn't stigmatize the conversation. And we're not a service provider. We don't provide goods and services to the local community. We have more of a convening and training and more of a legal mandate around how to work with these groups to provide or to ensure that they provide these services within the population that they control or the area that they control. Was there a second part to your question that I've missed? I apologize.
No, that's
Okay.
definitely answered it.
Okay, great.
Thanks so much. Go ahead.
Let's see if I can actually operate this. There we go. Thanks very much for hosting this today, and thanks for having us. My name is Caitlin Pritchard. I'm with the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C., but was previously the Human Rights and Humanitarian Advisor to the Canadian Mission to the UN. Tasha, it's great to see a former colleague up on the screen, and thanks so much for your comments. I actually have two questions. And the first is maybe better targeted toward Tasha and Leisha. But we've heard reports recently of the relocation of a number of children from occupied portions of Ukraine. And this has primarily been done on, a fairly obvious violation, I would say, of international humanitarian law, but it's being done under kind of the guise of protection of children. And this idea that children who have been found in occupied areas, in orphanages and other places, or whose parents have been killed, are being sent to live in parts of Russia with families effectively to protect them. And I'm just curious to know to what extent, I mean, you may be able to speak to specific situations, if not kind of in a more general way. How do you engage with authorities when the justification for some of these violations happens to be the protection of children in a way that sort of gives a nod toward the international legal frameworks, but at the same time is really being done for ulterior motives? Are there things that are being done in these situations to kind of engage with those authorities, or are there things that governments and other actors can do to kind of better engage with those authorities to remind them of their obligations and kind of ensure that those protections are in place? And then my second question, and this is maybe better targeted toward Christy, has to do kind of with the incentives. I'm always fascinated to hear this when I hear Geneva Call talking about your work, and you do some really, really interesting work. But I'm curious to know, when you're having these conversations with non-state actors in particular, what do you find are the incentives that are most compelling for them? Obviously, if you're talking with a state, you've got something signed, you have something ratified, you can hold it up as an obligation. But when you're talking with non-state actors, and you've given a little bit of a nod to this as well, but is it the desire for legitimacy in a post-conflict environment? Is it the interest of continuing to be able to engage with communities? You've talked about children as a good access point. I'm just wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on what you find to be the most compelling arguments when you're engaging with non-state groups. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. We'll start with you, Leisha.
I was actually thinking perhaps Tasha might be best placed to start, but I can jump in.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Tasha.
Sure, thanks. And Caitlin, it's great to hear you, and I wish I could see you. Thanks very much for the question. We have been working extensively on the situation in Ukraine and engaging with all authorities, exactly as you said, to ensure that procedural safeguards are in place for unaccompanied separated children. This includes engaging all authorities inside and outside of Ukraine in all different territories to identify the allegations of forcible transfers and to ensure that the standards for family reunification are known by all authorities. We also offer our support to put in place systems to enable and facilitate and accelerate family reunification. This issue of family reunification is a right of the child in situations of armed conflict. And while I completely understand what you're saying about the concern about moving children, including children who have been in institutions for their safety, there still are procedural safeguards that have to be upheld. And that includes the agreement and consent of either parents or legal guardians in those situations. And so we are currently advocating and engaging to support those systems so there can be a reliable, predictable way for children to reunify with family members. I would just add that while there was a very significant population in Ukraine prior to February of children living in institution situations, whether they're boarding schools or full-time residential care, the vast majority of those children have parents or kin inside Ukraine. And therefore, we say that at all times throughout an emergency and after an emergency, family reunification should be the primary priority, and that we never assume that children are without parents or legal guardians until all avenues have been exhausted well after the end of a conflict or an emergency. So in terms of how to support efforts for those, efforts that support authorities to engage in these international standards for unification are certainly most welcome. Thank you.
I'll jump in now. I've heard so much about the wonderful work UNICEF is doing on this, so I was like, you should definitely go first.
Amazing.
I think one other thing, just to add on to what Tasha mentioned, and I think this is true across. I think this is a global thing rather than specific to Ukraine, is the importance of having coordinated approaches in relation to family tracing and reunification. I think there can be sometimes confusion or messiness around the processes when we don't talk to one another, and it really highlights the importance of having standardized processes, as Tasha mentioned, so that we know, so there's not as much capacity to say this is justified for this reason, because we are all on the same page, and it makes it easier to say, well, no, this is the communication that we have received on the appropriateness of doing this, and it makes it easier to have child-centered and family-centered approaches, as opposed to one agency doing one thing and one agency doing another. I think when it happens kind of coordinated, it just makes it easier to kind of stand together on these issues. But yeah, everything Tasha said, I think I second. Thanks.
Thank you both. And go ahead, Christy.
Caitlin, I think this is an absolutely crucial question, and to give the typical lawyer response, it depends. But it truly depends on the context, and I think this is also one of the wonderful aspects of Geneva Call's methodology, which is to have long-term sustained engagement at the local level, because every group's motivations might be different. And because of these long-term engagements, it's not, an ad hoc engagement by some Westerner coming in, because at the start of a conflict, but, local actors who speak the local language, part of the local community that develop these relationships over a longer period of time, we can engage at a much deeper level and to figure out what is going to be the best argument to use. Is it local religious or customs? Is it because they have family in the area and they might want to make sure that their families or their loved ones or their neighbors are protected? Do they want to seek legitimacy because they are an armed opposition group and trying to seek legitimacy at the international or even the national stage? Maybe as an example, Geneva Call was one of the only humanitarian organizations that wasn't kicked out of Afghanistan when the Taliban took over last year, because for many years during the previous government's authority, Geneva Call worked with the Taliban as the opposition group. And so they were well aware of how we engage, the neutrality of our engagement, the care that we provide, or the point of our engagement, which was to protect the civilians and the people under their control. And so when they took over last year, they were like, it's fine, we know you, keep going. And so our operations kept going right away. So there was no disruption. And now we engage with them around how to protect civilians, how to protect children, how to protect individuals most in need, while they are the de facto government. So, I think it really depends on, what is going to be from a humanitarian dialogue or humanitarian negotiation standpoint, trying to figure out what is it that your counterpart needs or wants, and then how do you have a conversation about how to get there and how to most effectively get there. To be honest, many of the groups who are seeking, that legitimacy in the eyes of the international community, being able to show that they are implementing humanitarian norms and principles and have been, that's been recognized, and they are being basically held accountable by the Canton of Geneva is a big draw for many of them, because they do want to show that they are taking care of the civilians under their control. They are abiding by international norms and principles, which they are required to under the Geneva Conventions, but of course they didn't sign the Geneva Convention, so they, it's a different way of having these conversations.
Thank you so much. Just want to return to a question from those participating remotely. Ahmed has been waiting patiently. Go ahead with your question or comment.
Hello everyone, my name is Ahmed Murtada. I'm a Syrian attorney and recently got my master's degree in IHL. My first question is for the representative of the UNICEF. You have mentioned that many organized armed groups were and are known as terrorists. And it is known that these groups are not legally obliged to international human rights law. So do you think that it will be more useful to not calling them terrorists in a way to convince them to cooperate and to oblige to these principles, especially in the humanitarian work and aid context? Thank you.
Thank you for that. Go
Would
ahead,
you like me
Tasha.
to go ahead? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Thanks very
please.
much for the question. And I might respond and then see whether Christy wants to add something as well, since she spoke to this issue. To clarify, UNICEF is not involved at all in these designations. Governments designate, also the United Nations designate as a member state entity. When armed groups are designated as terrorist armed groups, there are certain measures that come into place. As UNICEF, we engage with all parties to conflict, no matter their designation, for the protection of children and protection of women. And so therefore, in terms of our core commitments for children, the basis for our work, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we will continue to engage with every armed group in order to be able to prevent and end the grave violations. Where we have been able to engage in the international arena and policy arena is with states who are putting in place legal frameworks and policy frameworks to address the issue of terrorism, to ensure that those are in line with international human rights and with child rights. And so that is another part of our engagement in order to influence the impacts and the effects on children and their families and communities. So that's really where I would say that regardless, we continue to engage on the same grounds.
Thank you, Tasha. Christy, anything to add?
I mean, I would say we have a similar approach. We are not obviously involved in the designation process, but certainly we are having conversations with a wide variety of different actors and groups around the humanitarian norms and principles. And of course, hoping that this will reduce the levels of violence, increase the protections of children, of civilians in the areas where they are operating or controlling their territory.
Thank you. Please go ahead in the room.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much again to the panelists and for Foley Hoag for also hosting this event. My name is Noelle, and I'm currently a law and policy student at Johns Hopkins SAIS here in DC. I also have had past experience working with humanitarian, GBV, combating, and other organizations on the themes that we've touched on today. So this topic is very close to my heart. We also happen to have a humanitarian panel tomorrow at CSIS for my internship, so it's right at the nexus. I did want to pose a question that I think adds another dimension to this discussion, and that is the element of technology and digital use. We're talking about a wide range of youth, but the world has never been more connected, if you will. Twitter, obviously that's a contentious topic these days, Instagram, and other various platforms and chat rooms, I think complicates things when we get into the different channels propaganda is advanced by these different terrorist and armed groups. I guess I'm curious, it's a three-pronged question that I have. For humanitarian stakeholders that want to help, what resource allocation challenges for monitoring, and sort of understanding the digital landscape are currently being navigated? And I don't know if that's the best way to phrase that question, but I'll start there. The second piece is, how much is technology use part of the conversation with youth and their families in that humanitarian conversation? I think, Christy, you mentioned some of the practical programmatic elements. I'm just curious how much that's part of the conversation as well. And I think the third part is, just flew out of my head. The third part is, yes, the intersectional, any existing intersectional partnerships with some of these CSOs that maybe specialize in the tech landscape or digital landscape in these contexts you're working in. Thank you so much.
Thank you for those questions. Anybody want to go first? Christy?
Let me think. I mean, hopefully that was working. I think from an operational standpoint, we do work through a variety of sort of more modern technological means as well as old school. So we have different ways of engaging with youth, with civilian groups, with communities via social media, whether they be social media campaigns, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, working on different thematic topics. But we also do radio spots and, work with local media companies. So it really depends on what the local community actually uses as the most effective tool. And again, that's where having local presence on the ground, who know their community, they know what kind of tools would be most effective. If you're in a remote area where you can't get great service, and so engaging in a Facebook campaign or boosting posts on Facebook or another social media platform is not going to be very useful because no one's going to see it. But everybody listens to the radio, and you can have a spot around protection of children or protection of cultural heritage in Mali or something, but everybody's going to listen to it because the radio's always on. It might be a much more effective use, even if it's circa 1960, for many of those in this room, who would think, maybe radio is not the most effective, but we're sort of an equal opportunity, digital or technological ways of engaging. We're not going to be picky about that. We'll think about what's the most effective.
Leisha, any thoughts on technology in this work?
Yes, I do. I also think Dasha may have been unpinned because I seem to be full screen. So I'm sorry if you're all seeing my face really big. Okay, so I'll start with, I love this question. I think it's a really interesting one. I think that there's a lot of room for us to increase the way that we're thinking about tech and the way that we engage with partners on tech and the way that we learn. I think that there's a lot of ways that technology both can be, and my brain is kind of moving towards thinking about child rights violations and GBV more broadly in terms of tech, but we know that it can be something that is used to create violence. Like power can be used over through technology, but also it can be a way of us creating partnerships where people's voices can actually be heard louder. And I think that it's been, I feel like, at least for myself, and this isn't, for SAVE, but I learn a lot about how tech is connected to violence from the people who are kind of working in the tech spaces. I think it's interesting timing that you raise this, because we have Save the Children has an internal global conference where we're coming together to talk about violence and violations and technology in like next month. So I think it's an interesting time to be having these conversations. In terms of your questions around in relation to programming, I agree with what Christy mentioned in terms of we need to see what happens at the community level. I think that also comes with us not assuming that tech and tech-based platforms aren't an option, but how we can understand when they are and what works and who has access to tech in that space, so that we can make sure we're not just reaching those with the most power with technology, but really thinking about this from a kind of equity lens as well. Happy to talk more on tech, especially after I go to this conference and learn more. I can definitely talk to you more if it would be of interest. And then with regards to your question on intersectional partnerships, and I think, but tell me if this isn't what you were kind of pointing to, because we can talk about intersectionality from like a million different ways. I think what you were talking about is how we understand technology in relation to intersectionality in humanitarian work. Is that right? Or were you coming at it from a different kind of intersectional partnerships? Before I answered the wrong question.
I think that was a really great expansion of what I was originally trying to ask. So please, Laisha, please go that direction. Thank you.
Okay, all right, cool. I can do that. I think intersectionality seems to be something that is increasingly we're talking about more. How we move it beyond being a buzzword to being something that is practically applied is another step that I hope we take. I think what Christy mentioned in terms of all these different platforms, in terms of, you know, TikTok and Instagram and all these different spaces, I think we have a lot we can learn. I definitely know some things that I've learned from these spaces that I haven't from other spaces, and how we can then think about this in terms of who falls through, where are the gaps, like who falls through the cracks in these systems. And it's definitely a space where people's voices can be raised and where you can really see that movement coming up. I think how we use that, how we create partnerships that are equitable is a bigger question. How we really understand power and voice from a child rights lens, from a feminist lens, so that we're thinking about equity and power in relation to intersectional partnerships is a bigger thing. And that will, of course, also impact if we have partners who are in situations of armed conflict, who are partnering with US or UK or Europe based tech companies. Like, how do we navigate these spaces? It's definitely a bigger question than we have time for today, but it's something that I think is really interesting. And I think it does come back to how we navigate and move forwards on conversations around power and voice and access.
Thank you so much, Laisha. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. So I'm Claudia, I'm from Mexico, and a WCL student as well. And I'm a former liaison education in the ground back to Mexico for UNICEF. I was working in Guerrero, and as the Iranian person, the colleague, we don't have like an armed conflict recognized in the international law. I mean, looks like we have like outcomes and feels like, but it is not. So although we have this situation, when I was in the ground, I was experiencing something with the recruitment of the children in the militia for the self-defense against the cartels in Mexico. So I remember that it was very hard for me as a liaison officer there. And I was thinking right now how the agencies tackle the child recruitment in those countries that they have like armed conflict itself recognized for the international law. I mean, Geneva Call and Save the Children. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Christy, go ahead.
So in the countries where we work, this is of course one of the bigger issues that comes up for us, and it's one of the items included in our deed of commitment and something that we do quite a lot of training on. And so talking with the armed groups about, you know, what is the minimum threshold for recruitment in an armed force, in an armed group, we include the threshold age of 18 as our minimum standard. And so for the groups, the 31 groups that have signed this deed of commitment, you know, this is actually higher than the international legal standard under the CRC. And so, but it's obviously not an automatic given. And especially I think in communities where, adulthood is at an age, what is perceived to be adulthood is under the age of 18 in many of these communities. So it is around having these conversations around, what are humanitarian norms and principles? How can we best protect the civilians in this area? What are the benefits of making sure that children stay in school and have higher access to education? What sort of benefit would this provide to your community, to your economy, to your families, by making sure that kids stay in school rather than joining the armed forces below the age of 18? So I think there's a lot of different avenues and conversations that we would have with different armed groups in these different contexts around ensuring that that children are not recruited, or if they are recruited, that they are demobilized and released from service if they are under the age of 18.
Thank you. Aisha, do you want to jump in or?
Yeah, sure. I think we may have lost Tasha, so I can speak from my side at least. Thank you so much for the question. So again, if I miss anything that was within your question, do let me know. So in terms of child recruitment, I think from a kind of humanitarian lens, if we think about this across the identification of potential child soldiers, separation from those armed forces and armed groups, the rehabilitation, and then the reintegration, I think there's ways that we work around this from a kind of child rights lens across that journey, and making sure that is both thinking around having standardized or kind of grounded approaches within child protection and more broadly that fall within humanitarian principles is key, as well as that individualization on a context and across different individuals within rehabilitation and reintegration programming. That does tie into, again, the split that I mentioned before around the monitoring and reporting component that ties into that accountability piece and feeds back, and that we need to have safe approaches to doing this so that we support those who are doing the monitoring and reporting, as well as within the
I was trying to see if we could reconnect Tasha, but sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, very weird echo. Okay, can you hear me? You can hear me. Okay. As well as within the humanitarian piece. So these, I think both of these are really key when we're thinking about child recruitment. Within that, the child recruitment kind of component from a humanitarian lens, we're then thinking about this, as Christy mentioned, education, barriers and access, vocational training, legal support, child protection more broadly, mental health and psychosocial support, cash-based assistance and livelihoods, and how these tie in. And when we're thinking about child recruitment, it's important that we don't think about this in just a second, but how it ties in more broadly across the grave violations and within the child protection framework.
Thanks so much, Leisha, and we are out of time. I know Rena had a question, and if you're still on, feel free to ask that question. Otherwise, I would just ask for a concluding thought from Leisha and Christy. Rena, if you're still on and have your question, feel free to ask.
I'm still on, but I can also email the participants if we're running low on time.
Please go ahead.
Oh, sure. My question, I just finished a master's degree at Geneva Academy, so this was part of my thesis, so I thought I'd ask the experts since you're all in the room. So my question really relates to one of the challenges, Ms. Edwards, Christy, that you had highlighted in the beginning of your presentation regarding the detention of recruited children in armed conflict pursuant to anti-terrorism laws, and then maybe also national criminal laws. And I'm just wondering, do you see that there's a legal or policy gap offered to offer international protection for children in these situations? And if so, what would that gap be? Or is it just lack of enforcement of the existing legal framework?
I mean, I think the the Geneva Conventions, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Optional Protocol, I think there are very robust, as well as, of course, human rights framework. They are fairly robust. I think the issue really is enforcement. And how do you encourage state as well as non-state actors to be able to implement these issues on a variety of different levels. So for me, I think there's certainly a lot of protections, legal protections out there. It's more of a matter of how do you engage with a wide variety of actors to enforce that.
Okay, thank you.
Final thoughts before we end?
Leisha,
Sorry, your micro, I couldn't hear what you said.
any final thoughts before we
Oh.
conclude?
I gave you a dramatic pause because I couldn't hear you. Okay, yeah, I think this has been a really great space, and thanks to you and the other panelists and everyone who attended. It's been great to have to listen to other people and to have such thought-provoking questions. I think a couple of I'll be brief. A couple of things from my side just to kind of wrap up is, it's really important that we think about this with a frequent needs, conflict, and gender analysis to understand and have a more nuanced view of the risks, the need for sustainable, flexible funding that can support with the humanitarian programming, and also funding that can enable us to hold to create stronger accountability. Thinking around the root causes of issues in children in conflict as opposed to just the symptoms, so that we can do system level change as well as that life-saving humanitarian assistance, and really working with local communities so that we're moving away from this top-down model, but really working together with this community-based approach to understand what works and then to maximize on that. And of course, I'm going to talk about gender. So strengthening and thinking about this from a gender lens, both in terms of being gender sensitive, in terms of risks, thinking about gender transformative programming and understanding the unique needs of children of different gender identities, and modeling and championing gender transformative programming, and allowing youth to lead and have their voices be heard in terms of prevention and response, and driving forward a child rights and gender transformative approach. So thank you so much. That's kind of my nutshell. My email's in the chat if anyone wants to reach out on anything else or has other questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leisha, and thanks to all of you for being with us for this conversation. It's been invaluable to hear from you all with your experiences on the ground, and we'll just let Christy close off as having led this the organization of this discussion. Thank you, Christy.
Well, thank you. And again, thanks to Taffy, you and your team for hosting this conversation today, as well as to Leisha and Tasha for joining the conversation online. I think it's so important to hear these variety of different stakeholders, these different actors from all of these different perspectives. And I can only echo and reinforce what Leisha has also said about looking at the gender and intersectional issues that come up in all of these conversations, and how important it is to be thinking holistically about all of these challenges on the ground. We are talking about protection of the most vulnerable members of these communities. And so if we're not looking at all of the different gender implications, the intersectional implications, we're not seeing what the needs of, or all of the vulnerabilities and needs on the ground. So it's really important that we have those conversations, and that we are talking to a wide variety of stakeholders on the ground, and not just individuals, predominantly men with guns. So I want to say thank you so much to everyone who's in the audience today, everyone who's in the audience in the room, for all of your incredible questions and examples that you've given, and the issues you've raised. Certainly food for thought for all of us who are working on these issues. And I know many of you in the room here, and I'm sure online too, are working on these issues. So really look forward to engaging in continued conversation around these issues. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Bye, Leisha.
Thank you. Bye.